The 14th century's vision of beauty was less an aesthetic than a creed, a faith built on bones and shadows. To be pale, hollow, and spectral was not mere fashion, it was the measure of one's worth. Women bore this burden in silence, shaping themselves into images of sanctity that edged closer to the grave with every gesture. This ideal did not die within the century, it seeped into memory, into paintings, into the whispered instructions of mothers to daughters. Beauty became inheritance, but also curse. Each powder, each fast, each poisoned adornment bound women to a covenant of suffering, where devotion was counted in withered frames and poisoned blood. To look like death was to be admired, to be worshipped, to be called pure. But behind the portraits and the candlelit halls, behind the alabaster faces and jeweled gowns, lay the truth. Beauty was a slow undoing. Its worshippers did not simply live by its standards, they perished by them. Thus, the century closed, its definition of beauty preserved in both art and ash. What was remembered as elegance was, in truth, a shrine built to the poetry of decay. To be beautiful in the 14th century was to be pale, so pale that one's veins shimmered beneath the skin like faint rivers of blue. Complexion was currency, and the more colorless you appeared, the richer you were presumed to be. The sun was the great betrayer, for bronzed skin belonged to peasants who labored in fields. True nobility showed no trace of harvest, no blush of outdoor air, only the pallor of a life sheltered from toil. But nature rarely granted such whiteness, so artifice filled the void. Women applied powders ground from lead, chalk, and crushed pearls to bleach their faces. The mixture burned, cracked, and poisoned, yet its luminous effect was praised. Some even underwent bloodletting, draining their vitality so that their cheeks lost every hint of life's warmth. This ghostly ideal spread like doctrine, carved into tapestries and portraits. A noblewoman was not meant to look alive, she was meant to look untouchable, as though the world could not soil her. Fragility became fashion, and sickness became style. Pale skin was not just beauty, it was proof of elevation, proof that one's flesh belonged more to death than to the earth. To be beautiful in the 14th century was to be pale, so pale that one's veins shimmered beneath the skin like faint rivers of blue. Complexion was currency, and the more colorless you appeared, the richer you were presumed to be. The sun was the great betrayer, for bronzed skin belonged to peasants who labored in fields. True nobility showed no trace of harvest, no blush of outdoor air, only the pallor of a life sheltered from toil. But nature rarely granted such whiteness, so artifice filled the void. Women applied powders ground from lead, chalk, and crushed pearls to bleach their faces. The mixture burned, cracked, and poisoned, yet its luminous effect was praised. Some even underwent bloodletting, draining their vitality so that their cheeks lost every hint of life's warmth. This ghostly ideal spread like doctrine, carved into tapestries and portraits. A noblewoman was not meant to look alive, she was meant to look untouchable, as though the world could not soil her. Fragility became fashion, and sickness became style. Pale skin was not just beauty, it was proof of elevation, proof that one's flesh belonged more to death than to the earth. Beauty in the 14th century was never complete without adornment, though even jewels carried the language of fragility. Crowns and circlets rested on brows plucked high and bare, framing faces that seemed too delicate to support their weight. Pearls, pale as bone, were the favored treasure, strung at throats and sewn into gowns. They shimmered like tears, reinforcing the image of purity and sorrow. Clothing, too, conspired with the ideal. Gowns hung loose, draping thin frames so that bodies seemed smaller still. Long, trailing sleeves concealed arms grown thin through hunger, while pale fabrics reflected the candlelight in ghostly hues. Every thread whispered of restraint, of lives lived apart from the soil and sweat of labor. Even movement became part of the display. To walk slowly, to glide as though weighed down by one's garments, was to suggest delicacy. To stumble or sway was no disgrace, but proof of refinement, as though the body itself was too faint for the world it inhabited. Adornment did not celebrate life's vigor. It crowned the illusion of frailty, turning noble women into fragile effigies draped in silk and pearl, crowned not with strength but with quiet ruin. Behind closed doors, beauty demanded quiet suffering. Meals became rituals of denial, bread left untouched, meat pushed aside, a sip of watered wine serving as both nourishment and punishment. Hunger gnawed at the stomach like a restless animal, but to endure it was to triumph. Women learned to mask the ache with stillness, their silence mistaken for grace. Some practiced secret tricks, chewing herbs to dull appetite, rinsing the mouth with bitter vinegar, or swallowing pebbles to weigh the stomach down. Others clung to religious fasting as a cloak, using piety as excuse for their frailty. Each skipped meal became both devotion and display, a step closer to the thin, ethereal image revered in paintings. Servants whispered of fainting spells, of noble women collapsing in gardens or in chapel aisles. Yet such weakness was rarely seen as shameful. On the contrary, it was admired, a sign that beauty had taken hold, that the body itself was bowing beneath the weight of its own perfection. Hunger hollowed more than the belly. It hollowed the soul, leaving behind a figure admired not for vitality, but for the poetry of its slow unraveling. Behind every mask of beauty lay a quiet cruelty. The recipes for pale perfection were whispered from chamber to chamber, mixtures of lead, vinegar, chalk, and ground bone. Applied in layers, these pastes turned skin into a porcelain facade, smooth but brittle. The lead seeped slowly into the body, eroding health as it created the illusion of purity. A woman's face might gleam with ghostly brilliance, even as her bones ached and her blood grew thin. To complete the effect, lips were painted not with warmth, but with subdued shades, ashes mixed with vermilion, berries darkened with soot. Rouge was used sparingly, only enough to suggest a faint echo of life. Eyes were ringed with shadows, deepened with herbs or soot, enhancing the hollow, sleepless look that made the gaze seem spectral. Every gesture of adornment was an act of quiet self-destruction. Each mirror glance confirmed both triumph and doom. Women wore their beauty like a funeral shroud, knowing the very powders that perfected their appearance were slowly unmaking them. But in the logic of the age, this was not a tragedy. It was devotion to an ideal that demanded sacrifice. Beauty in the 14th century was never merely surface, it was burdened with morality. A pale, weakened body was not only fashionable, but righteous, a sign of chastity and restraint. To look robust was to be suspected of appetite, indulgence, and sin. The church's whispers entwined with society's gaze until the female body itself became a canvas upon which virtue, or its absence, was painted. To appear near death was to resemble the saints, figures in altarpieces whose eyes were cast heavenward, whose flesh was thin, whose suffering was noble. Women imitated these icons, believing that sanctity could be mirrored in physical frailty. The fragile frame, the wan complexion, the solemn face, it all suggested purity, detachment from worldly corruption. Thus, beauty was not freedom, but obedience. Women became monuments to silence, to denial, to stillness. Their very skin testified to a life lived apart from earthly labor and pleasure. To fail at this was not merely unfashionable, it was to risk appearing sinful, marked by vanity of the wrong sort. In these centuries, beauty was not about desire, it was about being seen as closer to heaven, yet chained to the rituals of decay. Thinness was a crown, and women wore it with pride. To be soft, full, or ruddy was to be accused of indulgence, even vulgarity. The ideal body of the 14th century was starved into elegance. Sharp cheekbones, a narrow waist, wrists that looked too fragile to bear the weight of a ring. Hollow cheeks and sunken eyes suggested discipline, restraint, and a beauty that denied the hunger of the flesh. Fasting was not only religious, but aesthetic. Noble women learned to eat sparingly, cutting meals short, nibbling on fruit rinds or sucking lemons to draw the roundness from their faces. Pain was a secret tutor, each pang in the stomach a reminder that beauty was being purchased, one missed meal at a time. To appear gaunt was to appear elevated, set apart from the brutish needs of common life. Starvation became a silent language, a testimony that one belonged to a higher order. The body was transformed into a living reliquary, thin as bone, delicate as glass. It was not health that was praised, but fragility, the appearance of a body always on the verge of vanishing. In the 14th century, beauty was born in darkness. The stone chambers of the nobility were cold, their air thick with the mingled scents of beeswax, damp wool, and smoke. Candles flickered and warped in metal sconces, their flames throwing shadows across mirrors that distorted more than they revealed. To look into one was to see not yourself, but the faint outline of what you ought to become, pale, hollow, and ethereal. Beauty here was not an ornament. It was a weapon, a discipline, a sign of moral worth. To be anything less than delicate was not only unfashionable, it was shameful. The body was to be sculpted not by life, but by the suggestion of its absence. Pale skin, sharp bones, lips drained of warmth. These were not accidents, but aspirations. Women submitted themselves to the slow ritual of vanishing, away from the sun, away from nourishment, away from health itself. They were expected to resemble saints in painted altarpieces, caught between holiness and decay. In these chambers of shadows, beauty was not radiance. It was the art of looking closer to death with each passing day. Painters of the 14th century became accomplices in the shaping of beauty. Their brushes did not record reality. They refined it, hollowed it, sanctified it. Noble patrons expected not themselves upon the canvas, but perfected spectres. Faces stretched pale as alabaster, cheeks smoothed of blemish, bodies thinned into sacred geometry. The portrait was less likeness than confession, declaring to the world that its subject had mastered the art of vanishing. Eyes were rendered wide and solemn, gazes turned heavenward or cast into shadow. Flesh was flattened, drained of warmth, until it resembled the fragile skin of relics preserved in churches. Artists exaggerated foreheads, heightened cheekbones, and elongated fingers, each brushstroke sharpening the illusion of ethereal frailty. What the canvas showed became the standard the living strove to imitate. Women compared themselves not to one another, but to painted saints and spectral queens whose beauty had already been embalmed in pigment. The portrait was both aspiration and curse. It immortalized an ideal that flesh could never sustain. And yet, women bled, starved, and poisoned themselves to make the mirror echo what the canvas had already declared divine.